In the vast history of Rome, filled with conquests, betrayals, and military feats that shaped the destiny of Europe, there are episodes that, although less remembered than battles like Zama or Cannae, had an equally decisive impact. One of these episodes was the so-called Battle of the Long Bridges, a confrontation that took place in 15 CE, in the wet and treacherous marshes of Germania. This conflict was not merely a military clash between Romans and Germans, it was, above all, a collision of wills, strategies, and worldviews. On one side was the imperial power of Rome, with its iron discipline, its seemingly unstoppable military machinery, and its conviction that Roman civilization must expand beyond the Rhine. On the other side was the cunning of a Germanic leader, Arminius, who had grown up within the Roman system itself, learning its methods and tactics, but who ultimately became the architect of some of Rome's most humiliating defeats. The Battle of the Long Bridges cannot be understood without looking back at the disaster of Teutoburg in 9 CE, when 3 entire legions were annihilated in an ambush planned by Arminius himself. That defeat seared Roman pride and became an open wound that even Augustus, the great founder of the empire, could not fully heal. It is said that for months, the emperor would wake up in the middle of the night shouting, "Varus, give me back my legions." That is why, years later, when the young and charismatic general Germanicus Julius Caesar, nephew and adopted heir of Tiberius, embarked on new campaigns in Germania, it was not just a military maneuver, it was an act of revenge and a restoration of Roman honor. Among these campaigns, the passage through the swamps known as the Pontes Longa became an emblematic scene where Roman discipline and perseverance clashed against the flexibility, cunning, and local knowledge of the Germanic peoples. Although this episode did not reach the scale of Teutoburg in terms of catastrophe, it served as a brutal reminder for Rome, in the wild lands of Germania, brute force and impeccable organization were not enough. There, nature, the climate, and irregular warfare worked against the invader. And above all, Arminius remained lurking, ready to demonstrate that Rome, powerful as it was, also had limits. The introduction to our story places us at a crucial point. Rome, still reeling from a historic defeat and eager for redemption, faced an enemy who knew its strengths but also its deepest weaknesses. From here, we will delve into Augustus's plans, Arminius's rise, and how the forests and marshes of Germania became allies of the barbarians and the executioner of thousands of Roman legionaries. After the bloody civil war that had left Rome exhausted and divided, Octavian Augustus achieved what few thought possible, consolidating his power, ending decades of internal violence, and initiating a period of relative stability known as the Pax Romana. But Augustus was not only a skilled politician, he was also a man of imperial ambitions, convinced that Rome's glory must expand beyond its natural borders. One of his boldest projects was to push the empire's boundaries north, beyond the Rhine, into the vast territories of Germania Magna. At first glance, it might have seemed like a logical goal. If Rome had successfully subdued the Gauls, integrated them into its structures, and transformed ancient Gaul into a prosperous region, why not repeat the same model with the Germanic peoples? For Augustus, the conquest of Germania was not meant to be merely military. His vision was broader, a profound Romanization, a process aimed at transforming the barbarians into citizens of the empire. To achieve this, he deployed a multifaceted strategy. The foundation of military and civilian colonies, serving as centers of control and hubs for cultural Romanization. The imposition of the Roman tax system, ensuring that the region's wealth fed the imperial treasury. A diplomatic policy of co-optation, in which many tribal leaders were enticed with honors, titles, and mixed marriages. On more than one occasion, daughters of Germanic chieftains were taken to Rome to be educated in Latin culture, becoming a bridge between both worlds. The emperor and his court believed that, over time, the Germans would yield to Roman power, just as the Celtic peoples of Gaul had. And in the early years, everything seemed to support this expectation. Between 4 and 6 CE, Tiberius, Augustus's stepson, carried out a series of successful campaigns that forced several tribes to swear allegiance and hand over hostages as a symbol of submission. The Roman military machine advanced with confidence, and to administer the new territory, Augustus appointed a governor, Publius Quinctilius Varus. An experienced politician, Varus's mission was to implement the Roman legal system, collect taxes, and consolidate imperial authority. To Rome, Germania was practically won. It was only a matter of turning that victory into permanent occupation and a new province. But what Rome perceived as a process of civilization was seen by the Germanic tribes as a direct threat to their identity, customs, and independence. Rather than feeling integrated, many clans began to harbor deep resentment toward the weight of Roman administration, the tributes, and the arrogance with which imperial officials treated local leaders. Amid this delicate balance between diplomacy and force emerged the figure of Arminius, a prince of the Cherusei tribe who had grown up within the Roman world. Educated as a Roman citizen, trained in the imperial army, and with an in-depth knowledge of legionary discipline, he seemed to be the perfect example of Augustus's project, a German turned Roman. Yet that very education would become the seed of a devastating betrayal. The dream of Augustus was about to turn into a nightmare. Blind faith in Roman superiority and the belief that peoples could be civilized by decree left the empire vulnerable to a very different reality, that of an untamable land and leaders willing to resist to the last. In the heart of Germania, amid dense forests and endless swamps, a figure was emerging who would forever mark the memory of Rome, Arminius, prince of the Cherusei. What set him apart from other tribal leaders was his personal history. He had spent part of his youth as a hostage in Rome, educated in the Latin language, trained in military tactics, and even recognized as a Roman citizen and knight. In the eyes of Augustus and his court, Arminius was living proof that the policy of Romanization worked. Serving as a cavalry officer in the imperial army, Arminius gained first-hand knowledge of the power and discipline of the legions. He learned how they marched, how they deployed in battle, and, most importantly, what their strengths and weaknesses were. That experience turned him into a man with two faces, Roman in appearance, Germanic in spirit. When he was sent back to his homeland, Rome considered him a loyal ally who would ensure the submission of the Cherusei. However, far from yielding to the allure of Roman civilization, Arminius began secretly weaving a network of alliances among the Germanic tribes. He knew that his people resented taxes, the haughty treatment of Roman officials, and the constant interference in their customs. He became the guiding thread of that collective anger, turning it into a carefully calculated plan. That plan culminated in 9 AD, when Governor Publius Quinctilius Varus, confident in the loyalty of the tribes, marched with 3 full legions, the 17, 18, and 19, through the dense Teutoburg forest. Alongside him traveled the full apparatus that accompanied a Roman army on campaign, engineers, slaves, merchants, and even families of legionaries. For Varus, it was a routine march; for Arminius, it was the perfect opportunity. The ambush was devastating. Taking advantage of the hostile terrain of the forest, with narrow paths, mud, and torrential rain, Arminius deployed a tactic he had learned from the Romans themselves: do not attack head-on, but divide and wear down. The legionaries, unable to deploy their usual formations, fell into chaotic fighting, where Roman discipline crumbled in the face of the swift and unexpected attacks of the Germanic warriors. For several days, the Romans were pursued, cornered, and annihilated. There was no mercy. The few prisoners captured were sacrificed in pagan rituals, and the legionary standards, sacred symbols of Rome's power, were seized and buried in the forest as trophies. The defeat was so great that the very names of those 3 legions disappeared forever from Roman records, as if the empire sought to erase that humiliating episode from memory. For Rome, the Battle of Teutoburg Forest was far more than a military loss; it was a psychological trauma. Emperor Augustus, upon receiving the news, was deeply shaken. Ancient sources recount how he struck the walls of his palace and wept, repeating, "Varus, give me back my legions." Arminius, on the other hand, emerged as a hero and symbol of resistance among the Germanic tribes. His success demonstrated that Rome was not invincible, that even the most powerful empire of antiquity could bleed. He became a leader capable of uniting, even temporarily, clans long divided by ancestral rivalries. The echo of Teutoburg spread throughout the empire. From then on, Rome ceased to see Germania as a province under construction and began to regard it as a wild, difficult to subdue land, where every forest could hide a new ambush and every swamp could swallow an entire legion. The news of the disaster struck Rome like lightning. The empire, accustomed to overwhelming victories and the notion that no enemy could resist its legions, was suddenly confronted with an unbearable truth. Deep in the forests of Germania, 3 of its finest legions had vanished without a trace. Emperor Augustus was forever marked by that defeat. Sources say that for months he would rise in the middle of the night, shouting, "Varus, give me back my legions." It was an episode that not only destroyed an army but wounded Rome's very pride. So much so that the numbers of legions 17, 18, and 19 were erased forever from the official Roman army list, as if oblivion were the only way to avenge their disappearance. Rome's first reaction was one of containment. Instead of launching an immediate campaign of reprisal, Augustus and his generals decided to secure the Rhine as a frontier, reinforcing military camps, building fortifications, and organizing a defensive network to prevent further Germanic incursions. It was an implicit admission that the ambitions to make Germania a stable province had been shattered at Teutoburg. While Rome debated between vengeance and caution, Arminius was consolidating his legend in Germania. To the tribes who participated in the ambush, he was the hero who had proven that the invincible Romans could be defeated. For others, previously undecided, his victory was proof that joining the resistance was worthwhile. However, his leadership was not easy. Unlike Rome, with its senate, laws, and professional army, Arminius had to maintain a fragile alliance among deeply divided clans. The Cherusci, Marcomanni, Bructeri, Marsi, and other peoples were traditional rivals, united only by the common threat of Rome. Arminius had no state, no institutions, no centralized economy. The only thing keeping him at the forefront was his military prestige and the reverential fear he inspired after the victory. Paradoxically, Arminius' most powerful weapon was precisely what Rome had given him, his Roman military training. He knew the discipline of the legions, the rhythms of their marches, the dependence on supply lines, and the rigidity of their formations. That knowledge, acquired as a soldier of the empire, now turned against Rome with devastating results. In Rome, the Senate debated. Some demanded a campaign of extermination to erase the shame. Others, more cautious, warned that repeating Varus' mistake could mean new catastrophes. Ultimately, the strategy chosen was pragmatic. Rome would not completely abandon Germania, but neither would it seek immediate conquest. Instead, it would strengthen its defenses and wait for the right moment to act. That moment would come a few years later under the command of a new general, Germanicus Julius Caesar, nephew of Emperor Tiberius, who would become the face of Roman revenge. But even before the clash arrived, it was clear that the name Arminius had shifted from being a trusted ally of Rome to becoming the most feared and respected enemy of his time, a symbol of resistance and a shadow that would accompany Rome for decades. With the death of Augustus in 14 AD, his successor Tiberius inherited not only the throne but also the open wound of Teutoburg. Although Tiberius was a pragmatic ruler, cautious about risky ventures, he understood that Rome's prestige required at least an attempt at retaliation. For this, he selected one of the most promising generals of his time, Germanicus Julius Caesar, Tiberius' nephew and descendant of the illustrious imperial family. Germanicus' mission was clear: avenge the fallen legions, restore Rome's honor, and, if possible, eliminate the figure of Arminius. To carry out this enterprise, one of the most ambitious expeditions ever seen in Germania was prepared. Between 14 and 16 AD, Germanicus mobilized several legions, Gallic auxiliaries, and allied cavalry, forming an army that at times exceeded 50,000 men. It was a display of strength, designed both to intimidate and to punish. But Germanicus knew he was not facing just any enemy. Arminius had proven himself a master of guerrilla warfare, capable of disappearing into the forests and reappearing at the most unexpected moment. For this reason, the young Roman general devised a strategy based on coordinated operations, advancing with several columns simultaneously, forcing the Germans to disperse and preventing them from concentrating all their forces in an ambush. Germanicus' campaigns included a mixture of direct attacks, raids, and displays of power. He penetrated hostile territories, devastated rebellious villages, and punished tribes that had supported Arminius, sending a clear message: Rome neither forgot nor forgave. In 15 AD, he even managed to recover the military standards, eagles, of some of the legions lost at Teutoburg, which had a profound symbolic impact on Roman pride. One of the most famous episodes of these expeditions occurred when Germanicus led his troops to the very site of the Teutoburg massacre. The remnants of the disaster were still there: bleached bones, rusted weapons, remains of makeshift camps. Roman soldiers wept at the sight of their forgotten comrades and held solemn funerals in honor of the fallen. Germanicus himself, with great theatricality, participated in the rituals, enhancing his image as a general who not only fought but shared the suffering of his men. However, Arminius did not remain passive. Aware that he could not defeat the legions in open battle, he again relied on his knowledge of the terrain. He prepared ambushes, harassed supply lines, and ensured that every step the Romans took in Germania was marked by uncertainty. For him, each battle was not just a confrontation, it was a lesson to keep resistance alive. The climax came in 16 AD when Germanicus and Arminius faced each other in one of the fiercest battles of the era, the Battle of Itastavizo, along the Weser River. There, thousands of Romans and Germans clashed in open combat. Germanicus, with a combination of discipline and strategy, imposed his strength and defeated Arminius' forces, forcing him to retreat. But although the battle was a Roman military victory, it was not decisive. Arminius survived, the tribes were not fully subdued, and Germania remained an ungovernable territory. To make matters worse, Tiberius, always pragmatic, ordered Germanicus to suspend the campaigns and return to Rome. The emperor feared that his nephew, with so much military prestige, might become a political rival. Thus, the war remained unfinished. The result was ambiguous: Rome partially avenged its honor, recovered some lost symbols, and demonstrated its resilience, but it never conquered Germania. Augustus' dream of transforming these lands into a Roman province evaporated forever. Instead, a lasting border was established, the Rhine, which for centuries would mark the boundary between Roman civilization and the Germanic world. The defeat in the Teutoburg forest and the subsequent battles, such as Pontes Longi and Itastavizo, left an indelible mark on Roman memory. Beyond the loss of 3 legions and thousands of lives, what Rome suffered in Germania was a crisis of identity. Until that moment, the Romans had considered their expansion almost inevitable, almost natural. Each war, each campaign, was eventually resolved by the annexation of new territory. But Teutoburg shattered that illusion. For the first time in a long while, the empire encountered a space it could not dominate. Germania was more than hostile territory, it was an environment that challenged Roman logic. Swamps, rain, endless forests, and untamable tribes demonstrated that Roman engineering, discipline, and organization had limits. This had far-reaching consequences. After Germanicus' campaigns, Emperor Tiberius made a strategic decision that would change Rome's course: to abandon the conquest of Germania and establish a defensive policy. The Rhine and Danube became natural borders, and instead of spending resources on uncertain expansion, Rome invested in reinforcing camps, roads, and fortifications along these lines. The psychological impact was equally profound. Arminius became the ghost that Rome could not forget. His figure embodied the paradox of Roman civilization, a man trained in the imperial army who, in the end, used that same knowledge to inflict the bitterest defeat. In Rome, he was seen as a traitor, but in Germania, he was celebrated as a liberator. Centuries later, even during the Renaissance and the modern era, his name would be invoked as a symbol of resistance against foreign empires. Moreover, the experience in Germania taught Rome a vital lesson: not all victories are won on the battlefield. Diplomacy, alliances with local tribes, and the use of buffer zones became pillars of Roman strategy on the frontiers. The empire realized that war of attrition, hostile terrain, and shifting alliances could be as dangerous as an enemy army. Militarily, Teutoburg promoted greater tactical adaptation. Generals began to value the importance of reconnaissance, knowledge of the terrain, and logistics. It was no longer just about marching in perfect formation, but knowing when to split forces, when to fortify, and when to retreat. Ultimately, the defeat in Germania marked a turning point. Rome would continue expanding into other regions, Britannia, Dacia, the east, but it would never again attempt to fully absorb the wild lands beyond the Rhine. The price had been too high. The echo of Teutoburg endured in collective memory, the idea that even the most powerful empire could be vulnerable to an apparently inferior enemy, if that enemy knew how to exploit unity, terrain, and cunning. The disaster at Teutoburg was not just a military defeat, but a brutal reminder that even the most powerful empires have limits. 3 entire legions, symbols of Rome's discipline and strength, were annihilated not in a frontal clash of armies, but in hostile terrain, against an enemy who turned their apparent weakness into their greatest strength. For Rome, the lesson was clear: brute force and numerical superiority do not always guarantee victory. Nature, geography, and the cunning of a leader like Arminius could tip the balance. It marked the beginning of a shift in mindset. Instead of expanding recklessly, the empire learned to protect, consolidate, and govern what it already possessed. Arminius' name was etched into history as the man who stopped Rome's advance to the north, while Germanicus embodied the Roman will to resist and maintain honor, even in the face of adversity. Neither achieved absolute victory, but together they represented the clash of 2 irreconcilable worlds, Rome's organized machinery and the indomitable freedom of the Germanic tribes. Even today, centuries later, the echo of that confrontation lives on. It reminds us that history is not always written by the strongest, but by those who know how to adapt, wait for the right moment, and turn the terrain into their greatest ally. And perhaps that is Teutoburg's most important lesson, that even the greatest power can falter when faced with the cunning and unity of those defending their land.